Recording. Great. Well, good morning, everybody, and good day from all different parts of the world. Welcome back to the CIB Presidential Seminar Series that we broadcast from Purdue University. As you all are aware, the theme for this semester and also for last semester is Distinguished Women Researchers in the Built Environment. And today, again, it is indeed my pleasure to introduce one such distinguished researcher, Dr. Kathy Michell. Let me give a little bit background on her achievements. So Kathy is on the full-time academic staff at the University of Cape Town and was head of the Department of Construction Economics and Management from 2017 to 2020, and the Deputy Dean for Undergraduate Studies, Teaching and Learning in the Faculty of Engineering and the Built Environment from 2021 to 2023. Kathy holds a doctorate in Property and Facilities Management from the University of Salford, an MPhil in Cost Systems Engineering, and BSc Honors in Quantity Surveying from the University of Cape Town. She's the director of the Sustainability-Oriented and Cyber Research Unit for the Built Environment at UCT. She's a registered professional quantity surveyor with the South African Council for the Quantity Surveying Profession and a member of the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors, as well as the Association of South African Quantity Surveyors and the South African Facilities Management Association. Kathy is a past president of the South African Council for the Quantity Surveying Profession and served a 4-year term as a council member on the Council for Built Environment in South Africa. She was the Africa Market Seat on the Governing Council of the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors from 2020 to 2023, is a current member of the board of the CIB International Council for Building and Construction Research, a member of the International Facilities Management Association Research Advisory Committee, and is a founding director of the Africa Facilities Management Association. Please welcome Dr. Kathy Michell. Kathy, over to you.
Thank you, Mark. Okay, so let's just, I know Cole walked me through this just now and it worked, but we'll just, okay. All good on your side, Cole, for now? And
yeah, looks great.
Mode. Okay, let me know when it's all.
You're good.
I'm good. Okay, so I presume you'll handle the controls in the back end because I can't see anything to do with Zoom and controls from my side.
Oh, really?
So good afternoon and good evening to everybody who's online, depending on where you are located in the globe. Today, I'm going to talk on sustainable urban development and management in African cities in search of Birnin Zana. And with the permission of Cole and Mark, I'm going to be a little bit provocative in the process. So I hope that all is okay. Just to give you, let's get my controls going. Okay. What I want to cover this morning for you guys in America, for me this evening, is to give an overview of the contextual landscape of African cities and then run through some of the challenges that we face. Look at what we mean by sustainable development and management, then to pose a question to both myself and to you, whether the fourth industrial revolution is the solution, and then where to from here. So to start with a contextual landscape, which I'm going to break down into some subsections. I'm going to start at the macro level and then bring it down to the peri-urban level to actually understand what is happening in African cities. So from a macro level context, as I'm sure we are all fully aware, cities across the globe are facing rapid urbanization and are expected to be at the front line of addressing issues of global sustainability. So the majority of the world's population growth is expected to be concentrated in the urban areas of what is considered to be the global south. For those that don't know the term, cities of the global south refers to countries that do not have fully industrialized economies, and in more blunt words, in post-colonial terms, it refers to countries that have experienced some form of colonial domination, which has left a permanent, indelible mark on their economic, cultural, and political landscape. So whilst I cannot speak to the context in other parts of the world, like Southeast Asia and South America, that would be considered global south in terms of this definition. Cities across Africa, in the main, are characterized by multiple forms of poverty, growing inequality, environmental degradation, slums and informal settlements, social and economic exclusion, and spatial segregation. Out of interest, just to put this in context, of the 1 billion global slum dwellers that, according to a variety of international organizations, 238 million of them live in the southern part of Africa. So that's fairly sobering. At another macro level is just to provide some context. Africa has a very young population. So it's projected that by 2050, as a percentage of overall population in the respective regions, only about 10% of Africa's population will be over the age of 60. So Africa's population is also projected to double between now and 2050, and 2/3 of this growth is expected to be absorbed into urban areas within Africa, within African cities. Another macro level context that we need to understand is to consider or bear in mind at this level is the extent to which there is transparency in the property or the real estate market across Africa. And in this regard, Africa does not fare well and would be considered from an investment perspective highly risky. Just out of interest, so that you can get some context on the slide, the very pale blue would be considered highly transparent, which is South Africa, and that's because there exists a lot of market data, followed fairly closely as in transparent to semi-transparent, Botswana, Zambia, and Kenya, and then low levels of transparency in areas like Nigeria and Ghana, very opaque, Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire, Angola, Mozambique, Tanzania, Uganda, and Ethiopia. The bits that are grayed out is where we cannot actually get any information, or that the information is not available. So they are more than opaque, if that makes sense. When we move from the macro level to the context, in other words, what am I actually talking about? African cities are facing significant challenges in terms of both planning for and coping with this rapid population growth and urbanization. The challenges that we face in Africa are specifically centered around high levels of poverty, high levels of inequality, spatial separation of residential areas from access to economic opportunities, and burgeoning informal settlements that lack the adequate infrastructure and services to sustain human life in the long term. So in order to put this into perspective, I've pulled 3 little examples just to give you some stats so that you can understand the severity of the situation. So my first example is the Kibera in Nairobi, Kenya. So out of context, in Kenya as a whole, there are 2.5 million slum dwellers that constitutes about 60% of the Kenyan population. And these 2.5 million slum dwellers occupy about 6% of the land. When we look specifically at the Kibera, which is considered to be the biggest slum or informal settlement in Kenya, there are roughly about 700,000 people living in the Kibera. The average size of a shack is 12 foot by 12 foot. And on average, there are about more than 8 people living in this particular shack. Only 20% of the households in Kibera have access to electricity. And central water collection is from 2 water pipes that service the Kibera. There are no sewage facilities, and it has roughly about a 50% unemployment rate. Okay, so that's in East Africa. Random example in West Africa, Old Fadama, known to the locals in Ghana as Sodom and Gomorrah, is in Accra, which is the capital of Ghana. It's one of Africa's and certainly Ghana's largest informal settlement slum. Houses roughly about 200,000 people, has a long history of forced removals, and which is still going on today. There's no security of tenure to the land and absolutely no infrastructure at all. If I bring it a little bit closer to home, to Khayelitsha, which is in Cape Town, in South Africa as a whole, there are 4,297 informal settlements like the ones depicted in the picture, and roughly about 2 million people in South Africa live in informal settlements. If we hone into Khayelitsha specifically, it houses, or it's not really a home, but it houses roughly about 400,000 people, which constitutes about 10% of the City of Cape Town metropolitan population. It is a blend of formal and informal housing. And just as an interesting random fact so that you can get a bit of context, there's roughly about 1 toilet per 5 families or 5 shacks on average. And it's usually a portable toilet, but otherwise there are very limited facilities. Go on, we carry, oops, it doesn't want to go. There we go. Okay. So further from a contextual perspective, the key elements that you're looking at in terms of African cities are rapid urbanization, high levels of poverty, informal settlements or slums, inequality, which is both spatial and economic, basic service delivery failure, local government limitations, poor urban governance, the presence of a dual economy, so that's both an informal economy and a formal economy, very low transparency in the market, high levels of uncertainty, and very often communal or customary rights to land ownership. And it's important to note that cities of the Global South display the most acute forms of ecological degradation, economic disparity, and spatial apartheid when compared to their counterparts in Latin America and Southeast Asia. So if the challenges aren't already obvious, there's more, unfortunately. So I'm going to run through those a little bit. Okay, so at an economic level, one of the challenges that face African cities is the existence of a dual approach by governments across the continent in their spending policy. The duality occurs where African cities are promoted in the global economy in order to stimulate investment and development in a particular country or an urban region. But at the same time, the governments have a spending policy that is aligned with the upliftment of the urban poor, for obvious reasons, having just given the context that I have. Both of these objectives should be viewed in a positive light, but it creates an unmanageable tension for government, where on the one hand, they are driving economic opportunity in being globally competitive, but on the other hand, they are creating an environment for the continued exclusion of the urban poor and a resultant continuation and steady growth in the social and spatial segregation of these communities most in need of actual spending and their assistance. We add to that the institutional structures. Many African cities are characterized by levels of institutional underdevelopment and an inability to facilitate the development and management of sustainable cities. The unintended consequence of this has resulted in significant growth in the number of non-state actors or non-profit organizations playing a key role in service delivery mechanisms to the urban poor, in a situation that is not unique to cities of the Global South. The challenge in Africa with the prevalence of these non-state actors is twofold. Firstly, it has the potential to overlay a form of urban governance that may not necessarily serve the interests of the majority of the local populace. And secondly, it has the potential to replicate historical westernized development paradigms that are seen to be a significant contributor to economic and social exclusion and the declining quality of life in African cities. Now, since we are CIB and it's kind of the built environment, where does this all fit in? So the rapid rate of urbanization in African cities brings with it additional challenges for both national and local policymakers across the continent, in that they now need to mediate between rapid and unregulated urbanization and achieving sustainable development. And these issues remain pretty big obstacles to sustainable development on the continent. In that context, the built environment sector has a meaningful role to play in addressing these challenges through proper planning, designing, financing, the development, the actual construction, the materials that we use, and then lastly, the governing and managing of the property in the human settlement itself, the urban precinct, and the city as a whole. So what do we mean by sustainable urban development and management in this context? So I'll just go through it. Okay, so having the concept of sustainable development, which I'm sure everybody in the audience knows, was conceived through the Brundtland Report back in 1987. And essentially this report looked to reconcile environmental considerations with that of human development. And as human development is concentrated in urban areas, global sustainability needs to be addressed at both the urban macro level and at the suburban level. The challenge in Africa with relying on the Brundtland definition is that epistemologically it is grounded in the triple bottom line, people, planet, profit, the 3 Ps. And that in relation to the urban poor, the concept of sustainability is too narrowly defined. It actually needs to be broader than that when you understand the contextual challenges that we face within African cities. So the need for us is to address the more widespread socioeconomic crisis, and that is by way a far bigger urgent priority than that of just purely environmentalism. It's essential that urban sustainability within Africa or within cities of the global south focuses on the socioeconomic concerns related to urban poverty. Not saying more or less, but you can't only look at the environmental aspect. You need to understand the socioeconomic challenges faced by communities in African cities in order to truly address sustainability. So a lot of academics, Edgar Peterson, I think, who's a Cape Townian an academic at the University of Cape Town, and I think a lady called Adriana Allen, who I think was South American or from Latin America, proposed these 5 dimensions to urban sustainability. These 5 dimensions to urban sustainability or urban development are encapsulated in the Habitat 3 New Urban Agenda, which makes significant strides in addressing the narrower traditional Brundtland Report definition of sustainability. What the majority of this work unfortunately fails to do is to articulate how this is actually to be implemented. So how do we actually implement these policies and strategies? Policy is fantastic. We've got a strategic vision, but now it needs to get implemented and operationalized. So more often than not, when you dig into these policies, they also fail to articulate how sustainable developments are to be managed, and more importantly, do not require built environment professionals to be cognizant of the management of that property or real estate and that urban precinct in the development phases of the project. So they're not actually thinking about the long-term sustainability, which would actually be in keeping with the true definition of sustainability. It's about worrying about future generations. The built environment professionals tend to see the development as that's it, it's a sustainable development, but they're not actually truly being sustainable without thinking about how this is going to be managed and operationalized post-construction. So what is needed are frameworks that are capable of accommodating the uniqueness and the complexity of different urban environments in a way that focuses very strongly on mobilizing community resources and their social capital. More importantly, I think what we need are innovative new ways to promote urban sustainability within cities of the global south or in Africa. And it's critical that these frameworks draw on the experiences of local stakeholders to generate participatory, collaborative, and integrated initiatives to drive sustainability and alleviate urban poverty, whilst remaining grounded in good governance that is characterized by decentralization, responsiveness, flexibility, and really has an ear to the ground. Furthermore, I would say that these frameworks need to be founded on the premise that the built environment disciplines cannot operate and exist independently, especially when driving urban sustainability. So we need to get away from that traditional kind of silo approach. So the systemic nature of the issues that are associated with sustainability requires unity and collaboration in pursuit of this equity and actually redressing or addressing rather the challenges that we have with respect to urban poverty in African cities. So given the title of the presentation that I gave Mark, sorry, let me just move it along. One significant challenge that we are facing at the moment, which is an external force actually, is the fourth industrial revolution, which is often put forward as the panacea to Africa's problems. So it's clear from a development point of view that we're at a critical tipping point in Africa's development because the need for development is significant. And what is often argued is that the fourth industrial revolution has the potential to turbocharge the socioeconomic development across the continent. So we remember that we are the youngest continent in the world, with 60% of our current population being youth. And the digital economy does provide an opportunity to unlock a new future for Africa's estimated 700 million young people. So, right. If we go on, see, Mark, I promised to bring it in. I'm going to blend it in now. So what are the biggest challenges in African cities? So the most well-known visual representation of what an African smart city looks like is represented in Birnin Zana, the golden city of Wakanda from the Marvel Black Panther series. So on the one hand, as an African scholar, when I look at Birnin Zana, it looks great. And it does not, what is good is it doesn't actually try to transplant a Eurocentric aesthetic onto an African context, which is important, but here comes the but. Africa, when you look at this, and the images that are in front of you, which you can just have a look at, are examples of the supposed smart cities in Africa. So Africa has been labeled as the last frontier for international property development. And sub-Saharan Africa's largest cities are currently being revisioned in the image of cities like Dubai and Shanghai and Singapore. Some examples are Silicon Valley in Kigali in Rwanda, that's this one. Tatu City, which is this one down the bottom in outside of Nairobi in Kenya, Konza City, also this one here. Hope City in Accra, this is this top right-hand one. Kigamboni and Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, and the list goes on for Kinshasa, Lagos, Luanda. Every major sort of big city in Africa appears to be putting forward a vision for what the smart city concept would look like. So the proposed new plans, when you look at them and when you read African scholars, what they're writing about it, for many of Africa's largest cities are now, most of these plans are, you can find them on the websites of international architectural engineering and property development companies. And it is argued by some of these African scholars, they depart even further from an African urban reality than the traditional post-colonial city plans do. So these master plans are labeled often as smart cities or as eco-cities, and these plans promise to modernize African cities and turn them into gateways for international investors. The thing to understand here, or to realize, is that many are being designed as satellite cities to major urban centers and are being justified as being located on empty land. But it is rare that this is the case. Much of this land is actively being farmed, and landowners that are being displaced rarely hold formal land title, but rather have land ownership through customary rights. So when you take a westernized view of how a developer would do a development, since you don't have a title deed to actually own this land, I can kind of just take it. So in the words of Vanessa Watson, who's a luminary planning expert in Africa, sadly passed away quite recently, she argues quite strongly, or she did, that these new urban visions and development plans appear to completely overlook the fact that at the moment, the bulk of the population in sub-Saharan African cities is extremely poor and live in informal settlements. And the reality on the ground is that the majority of urban populations live in deep poverty with minimal urban services. And some of these settlements are well located on urban land that is also attractive to developers. So attempts to implement these amazing, fantastical plans within existing cities will and is already having major exclusionary effects on vulnerable low-income groups through evictions and relocations. More importantly, these development interests bring with them a host of additional demands. For example, for new and particular forms of urban infrastructure and for forms of governance and decision-making that facilitate the actual happening of this investment and development process. Or to put more simply, it is likely that the state spending will be diverted in the general direction of supporting these dreams rather than meeting the basic services and housing needs of the much larger poor urban population. So overall, it is, if you read African scholars, the most likely outcome of these master plans is a steady worsening of the marginalization and the inequalities that already beset African cities. I think when you step back from it, you kind of have to say, well, Africa has its own history, its own culture, and its own future, and technology needs to be cognizant of that. So we're not going to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but we need to understand the complexity of African cities in order to implement this technology. So what is appropriate for the developed world is not necessarily appropriate for African cities. And if we are to take the step to smartness as a means to addressing the challenges facing African cities, we would ideally need to harness this technology and everything that comes with the 4IR to service our needs, to service African needs. And we may need a different understanding of what it means to be smart in an African context. So before I unpack that thought a little bit more, I want to just give a gentle reminder that there are a range of terms used to define smart and digital, but no universal definition. And as a caveat, a smart city is not necessarily digital, and a digital city is not necessarily smart. So a digital city is bringing in that digital layer, obviously, and efficiencies can be achieved in conventional methods of governance, service delivery, and relations of power and responsibility within a city structure. And the Internet of Things makes cities more efficient and makes them better managed. And eventually it is technology looking for a solution. A smart city, on the other hand, is one that identifies an issue, understands it, and figures out what is required, then looks for a suite of available technologies to determine which is the most appropriate. It's about finding a solution that is enabled by technology. This also requires, if you step back from it and think about it, a reframing of the role of the citizen in society and government actually becoming the provider, the enabler, and the supplier. And in that context as well, considering the extent of the contextual challenges that we have in African cities, how do we make our cities smart in this kind of context? So is it possible that smart city development is more likely to address structural issues facing African cities? So I decided to, a few years ago, we did a deep dive with the city of Cape Town to look at their what they claim to be their smart city strategy. The one good thing is they're not necessarily building a satellite city. This is about making the existing city smarter. So their strategy is underpinned by 4 pillars. The first is digital government. That's referring to how the city as an organization works. So that entails digitizing essentially the back office functions, improving the business function of the organization, and how citizens can access city services. All good. A big challenge coming, digital inclusion. This is a key aspect of being smart in Africa. There is an embedded assumption in going smart that there's equal access to the online services. So an imperative has to be what we call shrink the digital divide. So what that means is there is disparate access to, distribution, and use of technology and connectivity, most notably between the rich and poor. Making the city more accessible to all income groups needs to be an imperative, and creating equity around opportunities that access to technology enables for all citizens as opposed to only servicing the elite. The digital economy, which is around the city's goals as being globally competitive city that attracts talent and investment, and building on Cape Town's role as a global tech hub for South Africa, it's also about providing the skills and investment to foster innovations that support the smart city development within Cape Town. Another aspect is digital infrastructure. This is really, you've got to think of this as the base of the smart city pyramid, which needs to support the other 3 pillars. So more specifically, this involves services, networks, data centers, and the hardware required to support the IT capability. There's a large focus on developing this infrastructure and providing the catalyst for private sector to get involved in the space in Cape Town. And coupled with this is also the drive to ensure reliable electricity supply, as none of this will work without the requisite power to drive it. And that's not a unique challenge to South Africa. That is something that is endemic to the whole of Africa. We don't have reliable electricity supply. So to assume that everything can go digital in that sense of the word is a bit naive when not everybody has access to electricity. Now, there are some opportunities for Cape Town's smart city strategy when you unpack it. The IT backbone, the organization or the city has a world-class IT backbone, which the city runs off, provides a platform to launch a variety of initiatives. The city has already done this, and it has created a massive opportunity already that sets it apart from most other cities in Africa. One of the challenges in there, obviously, is ensuring uptime with what we call load shedding. So we have rolling blackouts because of insufficient electricity to supply the entire population. So the city of Cape Town already has big initiatives in place to be less and less reliant on coal-fired or traditional forms of electricity supply, and to go to solar and wind and renewable energies, and to ensure that Cape Town is has, well, I suppose, as much uptime from an electrical point of view as we can. Existing skills, very important. So being a tech hub already, there's a pool of skills and resources that are housed within the city. There's a lot of digital nomads that come and live and work in Cape Town for 3 months of the year, usually escaping the Northern Hemisphere winter. And this is at the city's doorstep, and there's huge potential here to unlock this talent to drive what is needed. There's also data opportunities. There's a citywide science team, which provides endless opportunities to improve service delivery and performance. There's also the ability to leapfrog technology. So many African cities are able to bypass traditional growth trajectories by using newer technology without having to invest in the older ones. A good example is landline versus cell phone technology. And then developing an open platform for collaboration. The city has already developed a platform to open up the organization to create a direct conduit or collaborative conduit with civil society and the private sector, and they use a digital platform to do this. But it's not without its challenges. 4 challenges that we've identified in driving a smart city strategy is lack of leadership. Smart city development requires strong and coordinated leadership. It's a lack of digital infrastructure. It's a critical element of a smart city. We still haven't done enough, primarily because it's not affordable. And then in short, a smart city will always be there's a lot of literature well, not a lot, but there is some literature that's arguing at the moment that a smart city will always be for the elite members of society unless we can provide affordable or free access to technology. And then institutional limitations. Smart city development requires strong institutions, and this means having the skills, the willingness to collaborate, change management experts, flexibility, and innovation. And then the big one as well is actually about narrowing that digital divide so that there is equal access to this infrastructure so that it benefits all citizens. So the question is, where to from here? Okay, that's we're not quite sure, because this is where we get into the work in progress. So we know the UN Habitat 3 New Urban Agenda. One of the key things that we are discovering is that you need to think long-term in a development project or a construction project. It's not just about the actual construction of the project, it's about what happens after that when you hand it over. And I did mention it earlier. So to be truly sustainable, you actually need to think about the post-construction as well. And we also know that it needs to be anything that happens, particularly amongst the urban poor, needs to be participatory, collaborative, and highly integrated. More, I know there's a lot from the research that we are doing at the moment. It's all work in progress. We know that each city or urban area is obviously unique and complex. We need to understand the community as a resource. They're not completely incapable. They are innovative within themselves. We need to adapt some form of innovation to actually try and leapfrog and speed up the alleviation of the challenges that we have. We do know it needs to be participatory, collaborative, and integrative. We need good governance. We need to eradicate the silo professional. Built environment professionals actually need to work together. And we do need a holistic response to the challenges that have been outlined earlier in this presentation. More work in progress. What we also know is that any technological implementation does, however, need to rely on reliable electricity supply, and something that is in short supply in Africa. But where innovations have been implemented, they're showing promise at reshaping urban fabric. So far, the innovations that have been implemented and are being successfully implemented is smart planning and construction to make better use of the built environment, sustainable transport and logistics to increase mobility and connectivity, and the clean energy and utilities to improve the efficiency of urban systems and the urban environment. Having said that, being positive, we all still know that we have a lot of challenges. So the challenges are numerous, and what is proposed, what I've just briefly mentioned, is not the panacea for the problems that we face in Africa. It's clear that it is imperative in meeting the challenges that we face, that sustainable urban development would need to embrace the 5 dimensions to sustainable urban development. Another critical aspect to achieving sustainable urban development would be the need to approach property development and management in an inclusionary, safe, resilient, and sustainable manner. And this requires active mechanisms on the part of government and the built environment professionals to assist in actually the delivery of the entire project. And it's only in taking this holistic view of the development process and the subsequent management of the product that the developer and society as a whole are truly able to capture the social, economic, and environmental value embedded in the actual sustainable development and management process. So what all this means for smart urbanism in Africa. So kind of thinking, if we're searching for Birnin Zana, where do we go? Because it all feels like doom and gloom, but it isn't really. So a couple of things that I think are really important as we drive our research agenda in Africa and dig deeper and try to find the solutions to solve, or to at least help alleviate some of the challenges that we face. The one is that interventions must be strategic, appropriate, well-timed, and inclusive. So what I mean by that is deciding what is appropriate to invest in and when is critical, not being dictated to by the technology firms or the shiny solution. So smart city development is not about keeping up with the Joneses. It's about making a real difference to the lives of all citizens. And that's where I make the distinction between the difference between the digital city versus the smart city. And whilst the two can coalesce, what we need is actually to be smart. The second is the push for digital infrastructure. This is critical. We have to make sure that the development drives equitable development and provides digital infrastructure, and electricity is central to that. So embedded in this is the radical idea of connectivity becoming a human right, like shelter or sanitation. The third, I think, key thing is that you can't have a smart city without having a smart city. I know that sounds a bit weird, but so a good understanding of technology and the need to be open to changing how they operate. This requires both IT skills and an understanding of the context of African cities. So a truly smart city requires strong institutions, and this is typically a problem in Africa. The fourth thing is that citizens are not just passive recipients of smart city interventions, and I think this is critical when you understand or appreciate the contextual landscape of African cities. So the general approach in the global north, these interventions are often imposed on society or the citizen, and they bring about change. For example, traffic management systems, whatever it might be, or a citizen app. And that's great, it's all well and good, but how do you implement a citizen app when 80% of the population can't interact as they don't have a smartphone, or they have limited access to electricity to charge the phone, even if they had it? So the result is an open data portal without the ability to access it and the skills to use it. And that is a significant challenge. So in driving or conceptualizing Birnin Zana, there's a lot of embedded assumptions about basic infrastructure and access to the technology and the widgets, whatever it might be, that you need to actually drive this through to implementation. So as I start to wrap up, I think if you step back and look at it, there are textures of complexity that exist in African cities. They have a way of making it work despite the challenges that I've outlined. And I often think there's a sense of freedom and beauty in the apparent chaos of an African city street. And this does not necessarily fit with a westernized ideal of what a city looks like, or indeed how it should operate. This rich embedded complexity requires a deep understanding of both the formal institutional structures and the informal institutional structures and how they interact in order to truly achieve sustainable urban development and management. So to me, this is about research, and more research to get that understanding. We then need to embed this African knowledge into our curricula and enable the digital know-how to empower smart citizens. Perhaps if we could do that, and I'm idealistic here, we will then find Birnin Zana. But the one thing is certain, it will probably not look like the Black Panther one. It will not feel like it, and it probably won't operate like the Hollywood version. So in the words of one of my colleagues at UCT, the powers that be can plan, but in Africa, at the end of the day, the market and the citizens decide. Thank you. I could carry on for a bit longer, but I think that's enough after nearly 40 minutes, if you're still all awake.
I think this was really very interesting presentation and indeed eye-opening in very many ways. Let me open the floor for questions. I already see Crystal. Go ahead, please.
Oh no, I didn't have a question. I was just applauding for Kathy. Thank you,
Just
Kathy.
applauding.
It was
Okay.
very,
Okay. Yeah.
very interesting and thought-provoking.
Well, I cannot see everybody's hand on my screen. So if you have a question, please open your mic and go ahead and ask. So while people are thinking about their question, Gary, let me start with my question. And very, as I said, I found your presentation to be very interesting and thought-provoking. And your reference to the search for Birnin Zana, the golden city of Wakanda, is really on the point of what you were trying to convey. My question was that when you were talking about the 5 levels of sustainability, you had in that figure political sustainability as well. And given that the political will or the political sustainability, both things would make perhaps a lot of difference in achieving urban development, urban sustainability. I thought, what were your views on that?
Yeah, I should have unpacked that model a bit more. So Mark, it doesn't refer, if you read the actual source literature from Adriana Allen and Ed Peterson, it doesn't refer to government politics. The political sustainability is about the tension between the other 4. So in a particular urban context, your emphasis, say if you're in an informal settlement or a slum and you're doing a development, you may want to place greater emphasis on social sustainability or physical sustainability. So there's this political tension between the 4 dimensions of social or cultural, economic, environmental, and physical. And what are the trade-offs between them? Because they're not always in perfect equilibrium.
So more
That
of a
makes
political tension between the other 4 rather than
the
stability of politics in a particular region.
Yeah, it can extend to, so it depends who the client is, who's driving the development. You may find that the economic sustainability is paramount at the expense of environmental and social sustainability. And, it just depends where the agenda is going with a particular development project.
If I may take a minute from somebody else's question, just to expand on that. So take Kibera, for instance. You mentioned that 60% of Kenyan population lives in Kibera. Now,
No. 60% of Kenya's population lives in informal settlements.
Informal settlements, okay.
Yeah, across the country, and the Kibera itself has it's probably the most concentrated, and it is in Nairobi. It's in the capital city.
Yeah, no, I've seen it. I've been there. But my question was that, if you take that development or that slum development in context, that represents a strong political strength for anybody leading the country, right? So there needs to be a political will in making all the implementations, just bringing digitalization, technology to fore. So my question, I guess, is based on your research, what have you determined about the political will to make a change?
I think there is political will, which is why you have that tension in government spending. So, vast amounts of government budgets, when you unpack them, are aimed at infrastructure and basic service delivery and upliftment of the urban poor. But you get this tension where you've got outside investors wanting to throw money at like the smart city, Tatu City or Bundle City. But to try and do that, there becomes this tension that for an African government, they want that investment because it means it's good for economic opportunities. But often with those developments, they're not going to put the infrastructure in. So the local government has to actually supply the basic infrastructure, as in roads and stormwater drains and water supply and that kind of thing. So you get, in some cases, you're starting to see money being diverted for providing the infrastructure for these supposed smart satellite cities outside of Nairobi, for example, Tatu City. But they don't, and that there is only a limited pot. So instead of now that infrastructure money going to upgrading the Kibera, for example, or informal settlements, it's being diverted to build a satellite city. That the last time, I mean, it's been a while since I've been in Nairobi, but the last time I was there, Tatu City was very empty. There was almost nobody there. It's like a ghost town.
That is very interesting. Let me go to the audience again and see if anybody has a question. Please open your mic and ask a question. You guys are still digesting. There was a lot to unpack in your presentation. That's for sure. But let me throw another question. While people are still thinking, that you mentioned about the fourth industrial revolution and the focus there being more on technology, adoption of technology, digitalization, 3D printing and things of that nature. The question that was coming to my mind was that construction industry all over the world is quite reluctant in adopting technology, right? So it probably has an even stronger impact in the African countries that you were talking about. So what role do you see the fourth industrial revolution having an impact on developing these smart cities when the built environment and the construction industry has a major role to play in that, and they're not going to adopt this technology quite easily?
Oh, that's a tough one, Mark. I think there are changes happening, but very, very slowly. I mean, we all know, for example, a 3D printing a house can be done in, a blink of an eye. But there's also resistance from society or local populations in these informal settlements, certainly in South Africa. I can't speak now for the rest of Africa. They don't want the 3D printed house, which we could do in a flash and in an ideal world solve the housing problem in South Africa. That they also don't even want the prefabricated, what do they call them? Innovative building technologies, IBTs. They don't want that. They want the traditional brick and mortar house. So there's also a perception, with a societal perception, that needs to change in that regard. So I think the other big resistance as well to innovation within the construction sector, I think in Africa, is that there's a perception that the technological innovation is going to take jobs away from people. Remembering that you've got very high unemployment rates. I mean, I can't speak for the rest of the continent, but in South Africa, I think our unemployment rate is sitting at about 34% now, which is very high. So, and any government-funded project requires a certain percentage of local labor to be used because it's seen as a means of actually providing economic opportunity, even if it's limited just for that project. So the technology is also perceived by a lot of people as being as taking jobs away from people that could actually then be working for a wage, even if it is barely a living wage, but nonetheless living for, getting some work, some money. Yeah. I think our best bet is in when we look at for the construction sector anyway, in terms of technological innovation, the most likely place where we're going to see change is amongst the built environment professionals in terms of how we design, how we interact there, how we think long term. If you're doing a traditional kind of structure within the formal sector, so, you know, building a hotel or high-rise office block or residential apartments, we can build the like wizards into that. But you need to understand that that's a very small section of the market. So it, for example, in Cape Town, I think the figure's around, it's like 70 to 75% of the market, of the real estate market actually is in the lower end and is, you know, tending towards more the informal economy, whereas, you know, we're only managing 25% in the bigger side. So there's a big sector of the market there that is not that is kind of overlooked. So I think for now, anyway, from a technological innovation point of view, the best bet is within the built environment professionals. How we plan, design, the actual construction process, I think, is likely to still continue to be traditional.
Very, very interesting, you know, because now we are also talking about the fifth industrial revolution, right? So more human-centric, sustainable, and you know, resilient communities. So in that context, you know, it almost feels like, and I would like to hear your opinion. It almost feels like the fifth industrial revolution needs to precede the fourth in African context. So
Yeah,
because sorry, go ahead. Your thoughts.
Oh, no, you go. I think we need to leapfrog the fourth and just go straight to the fifth, because then the everyday citizen, the human, will actually become a part of the whole process. Yeah, and that's why I didn't maybe articulate it very well. It's why I actually want to challenge built environment professionals who say that they are committed to sustainable development. Well, if you look at the definition of sustainability, it's about doing stuff today that doesn't harm future generations. So how can you do a development without being concerned about how it's going to manage and operate post-construction? Because it has a life cycle long after you've walked away, but you potentially, as a built environment professional, are making decisions now in the design stage. It has a long-term impact on the sustainability of that particular development and society, and hence future generations. So part of that, I would want to actually challenge the built environment professionals to say, you can't just think about your project, take your professional fee and walk away. What if you're truly sustainable and want to be committed to sustainability, you have to think about what's going to happen to that building 10 years, 15 years, 20 years down the line. And I think that requires a mindset shift. That's a mindset change within a built environment professional.
Yeah.
That you're not just designing and building and then, as I said, take your fees and walk away from the development. You actually need to, in the design phase, need to be concerned about how this building is going to operate, be managed and operate post-construction. Considering the majority of the expenses are actually in post-construction, in the life of the building, and the majority of, I don't know, I've never done a study, there's a research project, depending on the life of the building, which has the bigger carbon impact, the actual running of the building or the construction?
Yeah, no, indeed, and you know, if you put that in the context of Maslow's hierarchy, you know, the industrial 4.0 reflects more on the bottom layer, whereas, you know, 5.0 is climbing up the triangle.
Yeah,
but indeed,
that's also, I mean, on that Maslow's hierarchy, you've just raised it. I've always argued that when you're thinking environmental sustainability, that's actually higher up Maslow's hierarchy of needs, to be committed to recycling your waste and, you know, doing everything that you need to do to be more environmentally sustainable. That's actually further up. For the majority of people living in informal settlements in Africa, if your daily existence is actually concerned with level 1, but, you know, shelter, food, access to water, which impacts your quality of life and your well-being and everything that goes with it. If that is where your daily existence is, about where your next meal is coming from, the last thing on your mind is recycling your waste.
Yeah,
So
indeed.
we actually,
Sorry,
you know,
go ahead.
if you want, hence me saying for African cities or cities of the global south, I think the bigger issue is actually socioeconomic. If we could get the socioeconomic part right, I have a feeling that the environmental will follow on.
And that's why I was raising those two concerns. That seems that 5.0 needs to precede 4.0 in the global south in that sense. But also, my reference to Maslow's hierarchy was more in the context of the built environment professionals or the contractors, that if their focus is more on the lower level of the Maslow's hierarchy, as in making money and sustenance and protecting their businesses, then they are less likely to think about sustainability and resilience and whether the building is going to sustain for 10 years or 15 years, right? So that's the context I was trying to raise. That
yeah, completely
thoughts.
agree with you. Yeah, no, completely agree with you. I mean, so the question is, if that's a challenge, how do we change that? Part of it is, I mean, some of us are blessed to be academics and have, sitting in classrooms with students is about to bring that awareness to future built environment professionals, and maybe even the built environment professional bodies need to think about including something like that in the professional code of ethics.
Yeah, indeed.
I
see those. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry, finish your thought. The Professor Widener was getting ready to ask a question, so I'll hand it over to him.
Thank you for your presentation, and I appreciate your use of the Sustainable Development Goals. So in order to get over some of the problems that you've been discussing in the most recent last few minutes, which of the Sustainable Development Goals would you prioritize to do first? Because there are 17 and they can't all be done at once.
I think it depends, is it Ted? Sorry, I can't really, or Prof. Widener.
Yes, it's Ted.
I'm not slipping out of answering the question, but based on the research that we are doing already in UCT, myself and some of my colleagues and other colleagues around the country, certainly in South Africa, is my answer would have to be, it depends on the urban area that you are doing the research or working in, because the context of a particular community is unique to them. So, and again, there's a caveat I'm going to put in there as well, is that what we have learned is that you don't walk into a community like that and assume you have the solution. In other words, you as either the researcher or the academic or the built environment professional do not necessarily have the solution. So the first part of the process is actually doing a lot of listening to what it is that particular community prioritizes, what's important to them, what they need. So this is the participatory, collaborative. Then based on what they've identified as being a priority, we work together to try and find a solution to help them. So in a particular community, it might be important that clean water and sanitation is a priority, because they have to walk 5 kilometers to the nearest tap. Or there is water, there's a local river, but it is filled with effluent and it's not drinkable. So it just depends. It may be some of them don't have energy, they don't have electricity, there's no street lighting, and that raises a safety and security concern. So yeah, I would say that it is contextual, depends on the particular informal settlement or slum that you are working in.
Thank you. That's a
And
very good answer. Thank you.
And in my experience, the local community are actually very, very good at articulating exactly what it is that they need. And if you get them on board, it tends to be a win-win. That whatever initiative you do, you're going to overcome quite a few of the obstacles that you might find traditionally developing in those informal settlements. Yeah. Thanks for the question, Ted. That was a good one.
Let me see if anybody has. We have a few more minutes left. If there's a pressing question, anybody?
Thank you so much, Professor.
Yeah, go ahead.
My name
Ruben.
is Toby, and I'm a grad student from Nigeria. So there was a time you're talking about transparency within the different countries in Africa, and then you were kind of varying them based on high level of transparency and all of that. So I think the first question I want to ask is, what were the metrics used to classify the transparency? And also, how can the transparency between countries be improved to actually promote urban development and sustainability in this built environment, in urbanization, most of the cities in Africa? Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so first of all, it wasn't me who did the analysis. I think I can find the source of, I think it was a McKinsey report. And the Global Real Estate Transparency Index that they put together is based on availability of data within the market. So if somebody from another part of the world was to try and access market-related data about, say, for example, since your home country, Nigerian real estate property market, there's not a huge amount of easily accessible information. It is there on the ground. It's not like it doesn't exist, but it's not formally published in a way that you can access it from another part of the world. So it's not like there's the Nigerian property markets, say in Lagos or Abuja, are available through the MSCI database. It's that transparency that's not available. In order to make informed financial decisions about investment potential. Now, the interesting thing about that is that it doesn't mean that the transactions don't happen. They do happen. I mean, your home country is Nigeria, you'll know that the developments do happen and, transactions do occur. But for somebody looking from the outside, a property investor from outside wanting to invest in the real estate market, there isn't a lot of transparency around market specifically, and they can't access it. So MSCI is one of the big global ones. The data isn't there. There is some interesting work that's recently been done in the Ugandan property market, looking at the difference between neoclassical or neoliberal economic theory and institutional economic theory, and basically arguing and showing quite clearly that the neoclassical or neoliberal economic theory doesn't actually apply when looking at African real estate markets. So sorry if it's a bit economic, but that's where that one comes from.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Toby, for the question. Any other questions? Right.
Thank you for
Well,
Professor. Sorry, I have a question.
yes, Manoj, go ahead.
Thank you for your presentation. I really enjoyed it. You explained about people that should be adapted to this new technology and smart cities. I know that you explained about that, but I want to know, considering the challenges faced by many communities in Africa cities, such as limited access to electricity that you mentioned, and also digital infrastructure, how do you think the implementation of smart city initiatives should account for the readiness and willingness of people to adapt to advanced technologies? And also, do you believe that comprehensive plans should be developed to prepare the society for such challenges in their way of life? And also, for example, do you think it's necessary to implement these plans in different layers to ensure successful adoption? And for example, do you have any strategic or approaches that you think would be effective in this regard or not?
Okay, so a lot of questions there. You might need to give it to me one by one. So the interesting thing is, whilst we don't have electricity, somehow we always seem to make a plan. If you ever come, have you ever been to Africa or South Africa?
No, unfortunately.
So you'll find that the locals, we're quite flexible and we make a plan. So in a lot of countries in Africa, they rely a lot on generators, generator backup power in homes, hotels, office blocks, whatever, because you actually know that at some point in time, the electricity is going to go off and you're going to have rolling blackouts. So most very large buildings have backup diesel generator power. Good or bad, there's pros and cons to that. The interesting thing about, I think there was another one there about how do you prepare people for the digital economy or the digital infrastructure, whatever it might be. The interesting thing is to actually, which is my statement right at the end, is do we plan this implementation or do you just let it naturally grow and evolve? And there is a context to why actually, the plan is planned and the market decides. That there's a conscious thought behind that statement. So Africans are incredibly innovative and entrepreneurial. They will find a way to find a solution that actually makes their lives easier and better. So for example, in Kenya, because of challenges within the banking system, I think that was the reason there's an online currency called an M-Pesa that people trade with in the informal settlement because it's pretty difficult to open a bank account when you don't have a street address, when you live in a shack, but you still need to be able to transact. So they transact in their own virtual currency called M-Pesas. So yeah, so I don't think I'm really answering your question, but one thing that I do know in my gut, and I can't prove it, is that a top-down approach generally doesn't work in Africa. It has to be grassroots, bottom-up driven. Whatever it is that you're doing, whether it's a development, whether it's implementing sustainability initiatives, and I think that's a legacy of, I think, Africa's history. Because it was so radically colonized. Certainly in South Africa, top-down does not work. It has to be grassroots, bottom-up driven. Hence my response to Ted about listening. I don't know if I've answered your question. I think there might have been more questions there that I didn't answer. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Birnin. That was a good question. In closing, does anybody have a question? Before I ask my last question. So, Kathy, unfortunately we're running out of time, and but I always take the last question. So here's my last question. We've been talking about urban development, and I want to come back to your example about the golden city of Wakanda, the Birnin Zana, and you shared some of the vision that people have created. There were 3 or 4 different visions that you were sharing about Birnin Zana. So my question is that, and I think you did touch upon it also in your presentation, but in following urban development, of that nature, would it not displace more people and lead towards more poverty? Given that you mentioned about space, for instance, so that's really very true. But also all the resources that would be required in creating those urban development cities, not counting labor, but counting material and all the other requirements, the impact on the infrastructure such as water, wastewater, and so on. So what are your thoughts on that, in terms of how realistic do you think would it be in the present circumstances?
Well, some of them are going ahead, which is interesting in itself. That some of them would just talk and the plans are there, but the money is never materialized and nothing's happening. But there is a strong argument I think across the continent from a lot of academics, that going ahead with this shiny, glossy city, smart city, brand new city that looks like any world-class first world city is not really the solution to Africa's problems. It just further entrenches the existing paradigm. And in fact, the smart city is actually for the elite members of society, and actually further divides that inequality between the urban poor and, you know, those that have and those that have not. So there's quite a strong argument about that. I personally think that I don't want to slam the glossy. I mean, the glossy looks amazing on paper. Are we not, to be truly smart, should we not be trying to make our existing cities more efficient and manage them better? Which is why I spoke briefly about Cape Town's smart city strategy, who said we're not going to build the shiny new widget, whatever it is. Then we're actually going to look at what we've got and try and improve what we do and bring the citizens with us on that journey. And maybe that's what it means to be smart. We can embrace the digital technology that's there in order to improve efficiencies and governance and all the bits and pieces that go with it, but we don't necessarily need the brand new shiny glossy, you know, I don't know, something that looks like it's fallen out of a page of one of your top cities in the world, top in inverted commas cities in the world. We should be using, actually, here it goes, Mark. In actual fact, to be sustainable, we should be looking at our existing infrastructure to upgrade that rather than building new, because the most sustainable building is the one that is already built, because its carbon footprint or its carbon impact was felt at the time that it was built. So if you build something new, that is all its carbon impact is now. Those materials are coming out of the ground now, as opposed to, you know, material that was pulled out the ground 20 years ago, 30 years ago. So yeah, the most sustainable building is the one that is already built. So rather look to upgrade what we've actually got and actually question what it means to be smart. I don't have the answers, Mark, by the way. This is where the ongoing research is. What does it mean to be smart in an African city? What does smart city mean for Africa? I'm just not convinced that Birnin Zana is the answer, just given our context and the extent of the challenges that we have. So there is an argument. It's a wonderful paper written by Vanessa Watson, where she challenges, it was written in about 2014 or 2015, basically very strongly argues that these wonderful smart cities supposedly actually all that they're going to end up doing is further marginalizing the urban poor.
I think, Kathy, you touched upon very many issues that has raised more questions and a lot of things to think about, and I think that is a sign of a good seminar in itself, right? It raises more questions in your mind to start thinking about what about this, what about that solution. So I really appreciate you taking time, and thank you very much for this very interesting seminar. And so I would ask everybody now to please open their mics now and give it a big round of applause. Thank
you, Mark. Thank you for asking me to present. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And to all in the audience, thanks for joining today. And our journey continues, and I'll see you all next week. Thank you all. Bye.
Thank you, Mark. Bye.
Thanks, Kathy. Bye.